Hey guys, it's Medicosis Perfectionalis, where medicine makes perfect sense. Welcome back to another Cardiophysiology video in my Cardiology playlist. Your heart is like a factory. There is an input going into the heart and there is output leaving the heart. The input is via veins, whereas the output is through arteries. Any factory that has an output can measure that output, roughly speaking, by multiplying the number of employees times the productivity per employee. Similarly, you can calculate the cardiac output by multiplying how fast the heart is pumping, i.e. beats per minute, times the volume ejected per beat. I was not planning on making this video, however, a wonderful person named Jordan supported me generously and said, "Hey Medicosis, would you please create a cardiophysiology video?" My dear Jordan, of course I can, and your support means the world to me. So if you're watching this video right now, please take a moment and say thank you to Jordan in the comment section. And if anyone wants me to create a specific video on a specific topic, you can do so on my website. Here's your wonderful heart. How many hearts do you have anatomically? 1. Physiologically? 2. There is the right heart and there is the left heart. Let's start here. Left ventricle pumps blood to the aorta. This is oxygenated blood. The aorta distributes this oxygenated blood to every organ in your body. Each cell takes in oxygen and nutrients from the arterial side and dishes out carbon dioxide and waste into the venous side. The venous side will go here, inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, passing through the tricuspid valve. By the way, every valve in your heart has 3 cusps except this one. This one between the left atrium and the left ventricle has only 2 cusps. It's the mitral valve. Why do they call it mitral? Because it's similar to la mitre, which is a religious hat for some Catholic clergymen. Back to the deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle. It will be pumped through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary artery, and then it will take me to the lungs. The lungs will get rid of that carbon dioxide through exhalation and then inhale some oxygen. All of that oxygenated blood will go to the left atrium via pulmonary veins. Then oxygenated blood enters left atrium, and then through the mitral valve we go to the left ventricle, and then you repeat the story again. What's the next valve here? Aortic valve. Next, many students struggle with the concepts of ejection fraction and diastolic and systolic and all of this nonsense. It's a piece of cake. Look, imagine that I gave you 10 apples. You decided to keep 4 apples for you and eject or give away 6 apples. Let me ask you a question. How many apples did you eject? Answer: 6. What's the volume of apples that you ejected? 6 apples. The volume that you ejected is your stroke volume. So the stroke volume is 6 apples. The 4 apples that you decided to keep is the end systolic volume, which is the volume remaining in the heart at the end of systole, i.e. it didn't leave the heart during contraction. So when I came at the end of systole, after the heart has finished contraction, I found 4 apples still with you that you did not eject. And what do you call the 10 original apples that I gave you? End diastolic volume. Because at the end of diastole, you just relaxed and accepted all the apples, you had 10. 10 is the end diastolic volume, 4 is the end systolic volume. The difference between them is the stroke volume. So stroke volume equals end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Okay, if I gave you 10 apples and you ejected 6, what's the percentage that you ejected? Of course, it's gonna be 60%. That's right, and we call this the ejection fraction. But hey, Medicosis, let me ask you a question. Did I eject 6 apples or did I eject 60%? Well, if you're talking in absolute terms, the answer is 6 apples. But if you're talking in relative terms, it is 60%. The stroke volume is 6 because the stroke volume is the difference between the two. The ejection fraction is this stroke volume that you ejected over what I gave you in the beginning. So it's the stroke volume over the end diastolic volume. And since we know that the stroke volume is EDV minus ESV, we can also say that the ejection fraction is EDV minus ESV, which is the stroke volume, over EDV. What you ejected over what I gave you in the beginning. Absolute terms versus relative terms. So if the heart receives more input, i.e. more preload, which means more venous return, which means more end diastolic volume, of course the stroke volume will increase. If I gave you 20 apples instead of 10, of course you can eject more. Assuming that you will still eject 60%, 60% times 20 is greater than 60% times 10, which means that your cardiac output goes up because cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. So if the stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up. And when cardiac output goes up, arterial blood pressure goes up. Next, let's talk about the cardiac cycle and the topic that everyone loves, pressure volume loops. Please watch the video in my biology playlist before this one. Left ventricle, aorta, the rest of the body, and then superior inferior vena cava, go right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary arteries, lungs, and back to the pulmonary veins. When valves close, they give us a sound. When they open, they give no sound. The first heart sound is caused by closure of the mitral and tricuspid valve, but the second heart sound is due to the closure of the aortic and the pulmonic valves. Which one happens first, electricity or muscle contraction? Electricity first. Which means the P wave happens first, then the atrium contracts. The QRS wave, electricity, happens first, then the ventricle contracts. The T wave happens first, then the ventricle relaxes. Who contracts? Well, the atrium can contract and the ventricle can contract. But when we say systole in general, most of the time we're referring to the ventricle. If I want to refer to atrium, I will say atrial systole. But if I just say systole, I mean ventricular. Same thing with diastole. Normal blood pressure, 120/80. Where is that pressure? It's in the big arteries. This is not the pressure in your heart chambers. What's the pressure in my heart chambers then? Let me start with the first number, which is systolic. In your left ventricle, well, where do you think you got the 120 systolic from? You got it from your left ventricle. So it's 120 during systole. How about my left atrium? 10 during systole. How about my right atrium? 5. Right ventricle, 25. Mnemonic, just remember Uncle Sam and his coins. 5 cents, then 10 cents, and then 25 cents, and then I give you $1. Nickel, dime, quarter, dollar. These numbers that I just gave you are the systolic numbers. If you want the diastolic, all of them are almost zero. You can say 3, 4, 5 millimeters of mercury. No one cares. But be careful of the right atrium, because since it has to suck in blood through venous return, sometimes it becometh negative, which helps suck blood from your ankles up to your heart through venous return. Where did it get the negative from? Don't forget that your intrathoracic or intrapleural pressure is already negative. So the next organ, which is the lung, has negative pressure. So this organ will acquire similar pressure. Moreover, if you expand, your volume will go up, but your pressure will go down according to Boyle's law, provided that the temperature stays the same. And as you know, the body temperature stays the same around 37 degrees Celsius. So what's the normal blood pressure in big arteries? 120 during systole, 80 during diastole. What's the pressure in my left ventricle? 120, same, during systole. Almost zero during diastole. So if I ask the aorta, hey aorta, where did you get the 120 from? I got it from the left ventricle, which makes sense because the left ventricle contracts and pushes the blood here. But hey aorta, where did you get the 80 from? Please don't tell me that you got it from the left ventricle because the left ventricle doesn't have an 80 to give. It has zero during diastole. No, that's something unique to me. I am capable of recoiling around that blood. As I recoil, what's going to happen to the volume? Decreases. What's going to happen to the pressure? Increases. Instead of 0 during diastole, it increases to 80 because of the elastic recoil, something that's unique to arteries, not to ventricles. And this is the cause of the dicrotic notch or the dicrotic incisura of the aorta that you see in cardiac cycle graphs. Next, what do you think happens to the left ventricular volume as it pushes blood out of it? Of course, the volume goes down. But when it's receiving blood into it, the volume goes up. And therefore, we can put everything that we know so far on one graph. This is the pressure graph. The pressure of the ventricle goes to 120 upstairs and almost 0 downstairs. Systole versus diastole. But if you're talking about big arteries like the aorta, radial artery, brachial artery, etc., they go to 120 during systole and 80 instead of 0 during diastole, thanks to their elastic recoil. Remember, arteries are more elastic, veins are more compliant, relatively speaking. And here is the volume decreasing during systole, increasing during diastole. It's the volume of the ventricle. S1, closure of the mitral and tricuspid valves. When do they close? Just before systole, just before blood leaves the ventricle and goes to the outside. These two valves close to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricle to the atrium. How about S2? Closure of the aortic and pulmonic valves. When does that happen? Just before diastole, just before my ventricle fills with blood, to prevent the backflow of blood back to the ventricle. And here's the EKG. Remember, electrical changes first, then muscle contraction. Electrical changes first, then the ventricle contracts. S1 is here, S2 is here. Where should I put the pathological S3 and S4? Well, S3 is caused by the gush of fluid, volume overload. Blood starts to gush here in diastole because the ventricle is receiving a gush of blood, so S3 is here. How about S4? Just before the following S1 heart sound. Here is systole, the ventricle is contracting, and here's diastole, the ventricle is relaxing and receiving blood. In contraction, in the beginning, the ventricle is contracting, but the aortic valve is not opening yet, which means the ventricle acts as a closed chamber. Closed on this side because the mitral valve is closed, and closed on this side because the aortic valve is closed and has not opened yet. So it's called isovolumetric. The volume of the ventricle is the same. It could not shorten and shrink. After this, the saving grace, the aortic valve will open. Phew! All of that blood will leave the ventricle and go to the aorta. Rapid ejection. Everything that goes up must eventually come down. Reduce ejection. I'm still ejecting blood at a lower rate. Conversely, in diastole, in the beginning, everything is closed. The heart acts as a closed chamber. So it's isovolumetric relaxation. After this, the mitral and tricuspid valves will open. So the blood will gush from atria to ventricles. Rapid filling followed by slow or reduced filling. This leaves few drops of blood in the atria, so the atria will contract, atrial systole, to push those few bloods down to the ventricle. Now onto the pressure volume loop. Why do you call it pressure volume loop? Because pressure is here, volume is here. It's easier to look at the volume first. As the volume increases from here to here, do you think this is systole or diastole? If the volume of the ventricle increases, of course this is diastole. Conversely, if the volume is decreasing from this point to this point, what do you think is happening? It means that the blood is leaving the heart, leaving less volume inside the heart. So I'm decreasing. Diastole is here, systole is here. How do you get the blood to be ejected? I have to contract first to push that blood. In the beginning, the heart was a closed chamber. Isovolumetric contraction. After this, the aortic valve opened and I ejected that blood. Rapid filling, reduced filling. How do you get the blood to come to you? I have to relax first. In the beginning, it was isovolumetric. What do you mean by isovolumetric? I mean the volume did not change. From this point to this point, I'm still on the same point on the x-axis. Isovolumetric relaxation. After this, the mitral and tricuspid valves will open and the blood will gush into the ventricle and the volume will rise. Oh, by the way, the same graph can be used for the right ventricle, pressure versus volume. How do I know that this is talking about the right ventricle? Look at this number. It's 30. Oh, it's not 120. Yeah, this belongs to the right ventricle. Or you can do the same thing for the left ventricle. How do I know it's the left ventricle? It's 120 millimeters of mercury. That's the stronger, thicker ventricle. Or you can plot the left ventricle against the right ventricle. I think you can see the difference between the 120 and the 25. This is the pressure during systole in the left ventricle, and this is the pressure during systole in the right ventricle. During diastole, however, both of them are almost zero, unlike the big arteries that are capable of elastic recoil. Let's take it to the next level. We agreed that diastole is here because the volume goes up, and that systole is here because the volume goes down. Before we can get systole to happen, the heart acted like a closed chamber, isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Before the ventricle was able to receive that blood during diastole, it acted as a closed chamber, isovolumetric relaxation. When did the saving grace happen? When the aortic valve opened, allowing the blood to be ejected and the volume to decrease. And then what? After the blood gets ejected, rapid ejection and then slow ejection, the aortic valve will close to prevent the backflow of blood to the left ventricle. And when the aortic valve closes, it gives you a sound. It's S2 sound. After this, the ventricle will start to relax, but still the mitral valve is closed, so the ventricle acts as a closed chamber, isovolumetric relaxation, until the mitral valve opens and blood flows from left atrium to left ventricle. Blood is flowing right here and I'm filling. After this, the mitral valve will close so that when the ventricle contracts, blood does not flow back from the left ventricle to the left atrium. And when a valve closes, it gives you a sound. Mitral valve closure gives us S1. What's the highest volume ever in your left ventricle? It's the end diastolic volume. And what's the lowest volume? It's the end systolic volume. And what's the difference between them? It's called the stroke volume. Example, if my end systolic volume is 120 ml and the end systolic volume is 40 ml, can you calculate the stroke volume, please? It's 80 ml. 120 minus 40 equals 80. So the distance between this point and this point is literally the stroke volume. 120 over 80 is the pressure not in the ventricle but in big arteries. This is called systolic blood pressure and this is called diastolic blood pressure. The 120 is the same point as the greatest pressure ever in the left ventricle. It's called the maximal afterload pressure or the systolic pressure in the left ventricle. How about the diastolic pressure in the left ventricle? Almost zero. You can call it the left ventricular end diastolic pressure, while the left ventricular end systolic pressure is here, not quite 120. Why not? 120 was the maximal point in the midst of systole. But if you want the end systolic pressure, it's gonna be a little less, usually between 120 and 80. If you are a math nut, you remember that under every curve, there is something called area under the curve that can be calculated through calculus. Since this is not a curve, this is a loop, we have area inside the loop. It's called the stroke work, i.e. the energy required to eject blood in a stroke. Hence, stroke volume. Hence, stroke pressure. Quiz time. From this graph, can you calculate the stroke volume, the ejection fraction, and the systolic blood pressure, I mean in a big artery? And can you tell me which of these points, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc., represents S3, heart sound, and S4? Please pause. Let's answer these together. Stroke volume is what? End diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Here's the end diastolic, here's the end systolic. So it's 120 minus 35 equals 85. 85 what? Milliliters. Next, ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is what? Stroke volume, I just got that, over end diastolic volume. My stroke volume is 85, my end diastolic volume is 120, which gives me something akin to 71%. That is some robust ejection fraction, I can tell you that. Systolic blood pressure, i.e. blood pressure in big arteries during systole, the highest number of course, which is 120 millimeters of mercury. The point at which S3 is heard. S3 is abnormal. It's caused by gush of fluid. The fluid is gushing the most at E. Look at this. It's called rapid filling, baby. So it's E. How about S4? S4 happens just before S1. And where is S1? S1 is B. The point just before it is F, as in F me. Quiz time. You have 3 graphs here. Which one represents a healthy heart receiving digoxin medication? Please pause. Let's try to answer this together. Let me tell you something. You know what the slope of this graph is? You find yourself the point of origin, which is the 0 point here, and you go up, 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 up until you intersect with this point right here. Now you have a straight line that you can calculate its slope. If you remember from basic math, slope equals what? Rise over run. It also equals tan of this angle, which is the angle between that line and the x-axis. Not the y, not this angle. Nope, nope, nope. You'll mess it up. This angle right here. Okay, so that's the slope then. It's how big the angle is. Perfect. Let's compare among these 3. Here is the slope for graph B. It's a smaller angle. And here is the slope for graph C. Even smaller angle. The slope represents contractility, the force of contraction. Digoxin increases the force of contractility, which means you should choose the graph with the highest slope, highest force of contraction, which is A. So let's dot the I's and cross the T's. S3 is here, S4 is here, S1 is here, S2 is here. What's the slope of this line? It represents contractility. If you go this way, the angle gets bigger and contractility increases. If the entire graph is shifted to the right, then the angle decreases and contractility goes down. This was the best explanation of pressure volume loops ever. Systole, diastole. S1, S2. Pause and review. If you want to be an excellent student, bring a piece of paper and draw everything on the pressure volume loop from scratch and explain it to yourself as you go. Do it 3 times today, 3 times tomorrow, and 3 times next week, and you will remember this for a long time. This graph is important in physiology, it's important in pharmacology, of great importance in internal medicine and surgery. Don't forget to say thank you to Jordan in the comment section. If you want to learn more about many arrhythmias, heart attacks, and strokes, download my emergency medicine high yields course at medicosisperfectionalis.com. If you want to learn about the normal changes during pregnancy and the abnormal diseases that happen during pregnancy, such as gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, eclampsia, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, peripartum cardiomyopathy, and much more, download my OBGYN high yields course. And if you want to learn about antiarrhythmics, anti-anginal, antihypertensive medications, and even antihyperlipidemics, download my cardiac pharmacology course. If you do not wish to download my courses and you would rather watch them on YouTube, you can do so by clicking on the join button and choosing the highest tier. It will open up more than 300 premium videos for you that you can watch right now at double the playback speed if you want. Education is fun. Please subscribe, hit the bell, click on the join button. You can support me here or here. Go to my website to download my courses, notes, and cases. Be safe, stay happy, study hard. This is Medicosis Perfectionalis, where medicine makes perfect sense. Thank you, Jordan.